So I'm just looking at it. We've got a number of people already joined. So I'm going to turn it over to Yasmin, if that's all right. And she can start us. She'll introduce me, and then I'll introduce you. And she'll also start the recording. And then we'll just have a nice chat. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really nice to have more of a Q&A format. So okay. Thanks for that.
All right. I'm telling Yasmin, let's go ahead and start.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this year's second installment of the New Books in Asian Studies series hosted by the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. Today we are hosting Dr. Thomas Simpson to talk about his new book, The Frontier in British India. Here to introduce our lecturer and serve as our moderator and discussant for today is Dr. Benjamin Hopkins, director of the Sigur Center.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmin. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you virtually wherever you are in the world. I know a number of you are joining us from the United Kingdom, as well as hopefully a couple from Asia, other places in Europe, and across North America. So it's wonderful to have you here today. As Yasmin, who's worked so very hard to put this together, mentioned, this is our second installment of our New Books in Asian Studies series that we're having going. Our last installment was my colleague, Eric Schlussel, who talked about his new book, funnily enough, on frontiers in China. And our next installment will be with a colleague, Kyle Gardner, whose new book is just out with Cambridge University Press as well. And he'll be talking in March on his new book. But let's turn our attention to today and to our author of the moment, and that is an old friend and indeed a former student of mine, Tom Simpson. Tom is presently at Cambridge University, where he's a research fellow at Gondolin Keys and has been on a long-running Leverhulme grant while there. Tom finished his PhD a couple of years ago at Cambridge. I first encountered Tom as an undergraduate when he took a course with me when I taught for the first time at the London School of Economics much too long ago, and I won't dwell on that. But Tom's book, The Frontier in British India, is just literally out with Cambridge University Press, and that's what we're here to talk about today. As with our previous iterations of this, we're going to have a conversation. I encourage everyone to go ahead and dump questions into the Q&A box. You will find it on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll see Q&A. Just go ahead and pop that up. And as Tom and I are having this discussion, please go ahead and dump your questions in there, and I will be sure and integrate them into our discussion. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you here. Why did you write this book?
Start with the big question then. Thank you, and thanks for having me. And indeed, thanks for your teaching all those years ago. I also won't mention the year that you did. So why did I write this book? There's so many different ways I could go about answering this question. I think two ways in that I'd like to share with everyone are, on the one hand, a more kind of historiographical or theory focused way in, and then on the other, something that captures an element of, I suppose, personal fascination with the topic, without which I certainly couldn't have sustained an interest for the last decade or so in the topic since I started my PhD way back in 2011. So let's start perhaps with the slightly sort of drier answer to the question. I guess I believe, and I hope others will agree, having read the book, that bringing into conversation the various themes, regions, and fields of study that the book covers will shed light on each of those regions, themes, and fields of study. I think there's a real value in that sort of bringing into conversation. So I seek really to show how colonial knowledge and power at northwest and northeastern frontier of British India not only shared key features, but the agents of empire often connected them imaginatively in some cases, and also materially in others. I also argue that across field sciences, surveying and ethnography, and also in practices of state power, such as rendering boundaries, deploying military violence. Frontiers were what I call productively problematic for imperial personnel. And by this broadly, and I'm happy to answer a question going into a bit more depth on this if necessary, but broadly I mean that foreign people were, to use Antoinette Burton's term, troublesome. But they were troublesome in ways that soldiers, administrators, and men of science really valued. And in fact, they valued it so much that often these men were actively involved in much of this trouble. So that's sort of the core thesis, and I hope it's one, it's one that certainly sustained my interest in writing the book, and I hope it's one that will sustain readers' interests as well. Just briefly, the sort of a more personal answer is that really I've been fascinated by the kind of what I've seen as the capacity of India's frontiers to disrupt expectations of agents of empire, and actually equally to disrupt our expectations of thoughts and activities of agents of empire. Really ever since, well, my master's degree, which was back over a decade ago now. And I still remember being on a bus in London. I was a master's student that year, and reading George Curzon's very famous 1907 lecture on frontiers, and really finding it quite kind of electrifying when it's something I talk about or write and analyse in the conclusion to the book, but there's a really abrupt turn towards the end of this lecture from arguing basically that the British Empire is this kind of driving force behind a supposedly evolutionary process towards rationalised fixed borderlines. And he sort of suddenly and abruptly turns towards really, on the face of it, a very different way of configuring the frontier. This idea that imperial frontier making is, he says, an art rather than a science, and that kind of precarious and nebulous frontier zones are absolutely essential to the kind of operation of empire, and in some ways the operation of sort of the British masculine self. And so I guess I found this ambivalence, as I conceived of it, from the first time I read it, just utterly fascinating. And in some ways it sort of encapsulates, I guess, my main fascination with analysing empire from its edges. And the book as a whole, I think, could be read as a sort of an attempt to understand the roots of this ambivalence, this contradiction in Curzon's lecture, and its various manifestations through the 19th and then early 20th centuries. So I hope that's a sufficient answer.
Well, what it is this very rich answer that gives us a lot to play with, and you kind of preempt a number of my questions there. I didn't do justice in my introduction to just say what an incredible piece of scholarship this is. As I emailed you last night, man, I wish I could write like you. The writing is so lucid, clear, and in places lyrical and engaging, and just analytically precise at the same time as being very inviting and engaging. It's just really as much of a piece of scholarship, it's a piece of art. I mean that's a fantastic answer, because you kind of foreground some of the issues that you bring up in the book. I love your anecdote about reading Curzon's lecture on a bus, because of course that's your conclusion, which we'll get to, is re-engaging with that series of lectures. And your own answer there brings up so many different facets. I'm going to push you on a couple of these, and I want to begin with how you would place this piece of scholarship in the broader historiography, because obviously you're talking about, on the one hand, imperial South Asian history. On the other hand, we all know there's a burgeoning body of scholarship on frontiers. Some of the people who are listening in today, Kyle Gardner, for instance, being really definitive of this emerging field. I know through our own conversations recently and longer standing, you also are really keen to intervene in the history of science. So I would just ask, how do you conceptualize the historiographical intervention of this book here? And who are you trying to have a conversation with, as it were?
Yeah, thanks again, Ben. And kind words on writing. I should say that I'll keep some of the earlier drafts from everyone. I can assure you they weren't particularly lyrical or artistic. So historiography. I guess one of the things to say is that each of the chapters attempts to address and contribute to a slightly distinct historiographical field. I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but so for instance, the survey and maps chapter of the book, seeks to engage to cartographic history, and so there are these kind of discrete bodies of literature I refer to at appropriate places within the book, but then there are a few bodies of literature that I think I kind of consistently refer back to throughout. So I'll try to sort of briefly go over that. The first, and I'm not really sure this constitutes a kind of historiographical field as such, but it's one that I've tried, I suppose, to constitute something like a historiographical field, are histories that engage, particularly imperial histories, that engage in close of primary material to investigate this issue of how colonial and post-colonial rule often depends on various forms of forgetting, overlooking, and occluding, rather than accumulating and then disseminating information. So, to my mind, the scholars that I think about, who I don't necessarily think sort of relate to each other's work as such, but I'm trying to kind of bring together, are people like Anne-Laura Stoller and her work on imperial archives and the Dutch East Indies, and then from different sort of fields, African kind of colonial and post-colonial history, Keith Breckenridge, who's done fantastic work in history of science on South Africa, Tilly, who's again historian of science looking at colonial Africa more generally, and on this idea of kind of the willful limitations of British knowledge in Africa. And then also recent anthropologies of the state. Nijneke Matur's work in particular on the state's kind of strategies of inaction in contemporary upland India has been really influential. So broadly, these are all kind of coalesce around themes of forgetting, overlooking, and occluding, these rather sort of odd ways on the face of it of knowing and governing that I think are quite important. So that's one field. The second major field, I guess, spans both legal histories of empire. Lauren Benton's work is a sort of major element in this, and also work from geography, which I've become quite interested in, by the likes of Stuart Eldon, John Agnew. We're broadly concerned, I guess, with the fragmented and contested processes through which sovereign territory is constituted. And I think this clearly relates to, but I think in some ways, perhaps, I would like to think it was a bit beyond scholarship on frontiers, or at least a lot of scholarship frontiers, which I suppose often is rooted primarily in, was drawn from settler colonies, and perhaps particularly North America, and therefore tends often to tell of a kind of shift over some time scale or another from, in the famous words of Edelman and Aaron, from borderlands to borders. And I just didn't ever feel this quite stacked up as a model in the case of South Asia, at least not straightforwardly at all. So I instead tried to look to kind of political and, as I say, legal histories of empire, to sort of provide an alternative corpus. I'd then just like to, I guess, mention a couple of more sort of South Asian focused kind of subfields that have been of interest. I mean, I really would like to contribute to conversations among historians of India about how colonial power and knowledge functioned in the subcontinent. I've definitely found the work, particularly of people like John Wilson at King's London, and others, of course, who have sought to kind of move beyond broad dichotomy of, on the one hand, colonial rule as this kind of shallow set of interventions, and on the other, a kind of model of colonial rule as somewhat all-encompassing and crushing. I found that kind of work of John Wilson and others really useful in providing a kind of analytical vocabulary for thinking about regions and times when the state was frequently ineffective and internally fragmented, but also spectacularly and enduringly destructive, and to try to sort of balance how those two things can be simultaneously the case. People like Wilson have been really useful. And then finally, scholarship on frontiers in South Asia. And you've mentioned, I mean, Carl Gardner's work, and I'm really looking forward to the book launch as part of this series myself. I'm really lucky to be kind of part of, I guess, a cohort of scholars in Cambridge and well beyond, who have looked on this and who have picked up on your work, Ben, and the work of Magnus Marsden and many others, and tried to run with that. And so I feel that those scholars are people I have had conversations with throughout, and I want to carry on having conversations with through this book. I might just say very quickly, and sorry, this is a really long answer, but one of the things I've tried to do, I guess, in kind of putting my own spin on this scholarship, is taking models that have been fleshed out previously with reference either to the Northwest or to the Northeast in India, and try to kind of read them across to the other frontier. One instance where I found this is thinking about your concept, Ben, and Magnus's concept of fragments of the Northwest frontier, and then Magnus's work on Burma and Northeast India, which talks about a fractal frontier. It's really resonated with me, and I suppose I tried to kind of synthesize those a little bit, but also then hopefully kind of put my own spin on it, in saying that the sort of fragments and fractals of frontier space were nothing empire suffered. Again, empire, as I've already mentioned, sort of actively embraced and kind of even sought to foster such complexity, fragmented, and sort of fractal frontier making. So yeah, that's far too long an answer, but bearing with me.
An author should never apologize for talking about their work, especially when we give you such a short amount of time to try and compress, so rich a work as this into a spoken answer. I mean, as you've just outlined, one of the real strengths of the work is the number of different fields that are seemingly discrete that you really do engage and you bring together, I think, in a new way. And not just geographically, because as you say, you bring together the literature on the Northwest frontier and the Northeast frontier, but also history of science, history of violence and anxiety. I mean, you were talking about John Wilson, and I was thinking about Raj Chandabakar and his work on the idea of salutary neglect, and about the way that the colonial state, on the one hand, has these spaces of abnegation of authority and then intervenes with a great deal of violence. And I think that really resonates with your work and really does clearly come through on that. I want to push you on a couple of things that you just brought up in that answer, and that I think would be productive for us to think about. And that is actually to go back to kind of first principles, because on the one hand, I feel like there's a very famous Supreme Court case in the United States about the definition of pornography, where Justice Blackmun said, basically, I know it when I see it, right? In that case, he was actually saying this is not it. But rather, I think we run into that issue with frontiers as well, in the sense of that intuitively, probably everyone on this seminar has an idea of what we mean by frontiers, or rather what you mean by frontiers. But I'd like to push you a little bit to articulate that. I mean, in your closing, in your conclusion, actually in talking about Curzon's Remains lectures, you talk about frontiers as perpetually open and mutable zones defined by challenging embodied experiences. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by frontiers? And as a follow-up to that, we have two geographically distinct spaces that you focus on, the Northwest and the Northeast. And Kyle Gardner actually says, in comparing these two regions, are we comparing the same thing? Is the frontier of the Northwest indeed the same as the frontier of the Northeast?
Yeah, that's well, great question from you, and thanks for to Kyle for that question as well. Let me just make a note of Kyle's question as well as yours. So basically, I suppose how I define the frontier really comes back to one of the kind of key aims of the book, and one of the ways that yeah, my sort of central like analytical components, which is that I try to focus really on British India's frontiers as a kind of emic category, which in my case means particularly how agents of empire of various stripes, it should be added, understood and configured frontiers, and sometimes understood and configured in totally mutually incompatible ways. So the sort of very short answer to the question is that it's all about actors' categories, and that in a rather simplistic sense, my definition of the frontier is, or at least aspires to be, their definition of the frontier, as that shows up in particular times and places. But having said that, of course, you know, I inevitably will end up imposing some kind of definition around my object of study. In terms of, you know, prioritizing certain things and then excluding or perhaps, you know, underplaying others that could perfectly legitimately play a part in the study. I think that's inevitable. So I'll try to be honest about what that sort of looks like in my case. I think the most significant element of imposing my own definition is that the study, although I think quite wide-ranging, is of course still limited. It's limited, in my case, really to Baluchistan, to the area that then became Northwest Frontier Province, or the sort of more overtly frontier areas of that, plus then adjacent upland regions north of Kashmir. Then across in the northeast, it was really the region that became Northeast Frontier Tracts in the early 20th century, and the irregularly governed upland zones south of Assam and east of Bengal. So you know, the Niger Hills district as was, Khasi Hills, Garo Hills, Lushai Hills, now Mizoram, and so on. So I think this is justified by, you know, it's sort of justified by scholarly judgment in part. I think it's justified by their significance in British dictionaries and construction of India's frontiers. But of course, it also is, at some level, a practical decision to give at least some form of shape and focus to the book. And, you know, for instance, I don't discuss the area that Kyle discusses in his book. So, you know, there are deliberate omissions that I make. So that would be one way of sort of saying how I define frontier, the sort of spatial answer. Then I think the quotation that you mentioned from my conclusion, this sort of perpetually open and mutable zones, really that was an attempt on my part to sum up how agents of empire operating across various different fields, from, you know, the military to field and in administrative roles, sought not to reduce, or not simply to reduce, frontiers to linear, clear, fixed borders, but rather to maintain them as kind of hazy areas in which challenges went hand in hand with particular forms of knowledge and power, and in which they, as agents of empire, had kind of significant freedom of action. So in some ways, I wouldn't say that that quotation is an attempt to define frontiers once and for all from my perspective as, you know, a historian analysing them. This is not to say that all frontiers must have that quality, but it is rather to say that that was, I think, central to the definition of them within the relevant spheres in British India during the time that I study. So again, it's a kind of an attempt at a sort of summation of the actors category of frontier. To Kyle's question on Northwest and Northeast, I absolutely would say that there are enormous differences, not only between the Northwest and Northeast, but also within the Northwest and Northeast. I mean, as you know, he and many others, I'm sure, listening into this will be more than aware. The difference in topography and landscape between, let's say, you know, Chitral, north of Kashmir, and the desert of the in Baluchistan frontier is immense, and it was known to be immense and understood by agents of empire to be immense on the one hand. But what I suppose I am interested in is the ways in which, through this sort of transit of materials and ideas and imaginatively, agents of empire sort of managed at times to, as it were, lay to one side those differences and to imagine something like a unified frontier, at least for moments and for particular purposes. And the degree to which, again, this comes back to this sort of theme of forgetting and overlooking, the degree to which it was possible to sort of subsume enormous differences, both, politically and environmentally, but also societally, between, frontier inhabitants in, say, the Eastern Himalaya and around the Khyber Pass. It was thoroughly different societies, and yet with a sort of hazy invocation of the term tribe, they could be brought together sometimes for certain purposes, even as they were then distinguished at other times for other purposes. So yeah, imaginatively, there were moments where the frontier was very much unified, and then there were other moments where it was very much fragmented, and trying to understand the interplay between those is sort of a major task of mine in the book.
I mean, that's just fantastic, because, latent in your answer is just what an absolute mess the colonial enterprise, if we can even call it that, really was, not only externally, but internally, and these kind of contradictions that get themselves worked out over time and through space, I think really powerfully comes through this work. And to give you a little more of a shout out, I mean, though the work focuses on the Northeast and the Northwest, and as you say, you leave an omission of Ladakh, we have to give Kyle Gardner some space to play, and some others. You do also, invoke what is really British India's longest frontier, which of course are the frontiers with the princely states, when you talk about Eric Beverley's work on Hyderabad. And I think that's a really subtle but nonetheless interesting play you make with that. I mean, there's a couple of different ways we can take this, but before I do, I just give a shout out to the audience. We have some fantastic questions coming in. Please keep them coming. Some of these are comparative. I will work them in, don't worry. But I want to take the opportunity for what you just talked about, and that is the personalities involved. Because while this is a really intellectually incisive argument about the nature of the colonial state, it's also in many ways a very personal story. I mean, you have some wonderfully flawed characters throughout the story, beginning with one of these frontier administrators that, of course, knows his people and goes up and, that he knows them doesn't stop him from spilling their blood on a number of occasions. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the personalities of those involved and how you see that fitting into your story. And one of the things I've always been struck by, and that we have discussed, is on the one hand, the transmission of ideas and personnel between British Indias and even further afield, between the imperial spaces and the frontier spaces of the British Empire. And on the other hand, the specificity of local knowledge, the man on the spot who knows his people, who knows his administrative responsibilities. So could you talk a little bit about the personnel and the characters in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to say is that in some ways, studying the kind of characters, the individuals that I look at, and with I guess the insistence that individuals sort of do matter to this argument, that it's not just all about sort of grand structures, but it's about I suppose not only individuals as, I guess, predictable kind of components, but actually individuals as often quite indecisive and ambivalent players within within this. It is worth saying that, you know, they are often very hard individuals to sympathise with, to put it bluntly. And I don't think this will come as any great surprise to anyone with even the most passing familiarity with imperial and colonial history. But, you know, they hold attitudes that are and should be, you know, incredibly difficult to stomach. And yeah, this shift between sort of registers of romanticism and deployments of, you know, large scale violence is really quite horrendous and troubling, and shows up, you know, very frequently. So I think what I would say is that I've been lucky enough through the process of researching with a few of those individual characters to sort of feel as though I've at least managed to get something like a relatively well-rounded kind of understanding of them, in a way that means that it is possible to highlight, you know, their ambiguities, their complexities. One that I might just mention one to sort of flesh this out a little bit. One figure that I discuss at some length is Robert Woodthorpe, who in some ways, I guess, I think, you know, comes to kind of typify, or at least serves as a sort of typical case study of a kind of generation of individuals that came to be thought of as sort of frontier specialists in the later decades of the 19th century. So Woodthorpe was first stationed in India in the very late 1860s, and his archival traces and collections are particularly located at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is somewhere that I've worked quite extensively and had the privilege of working with some amazing territorial staff there. And so with Woodthorpe, we have kind of archival traces that are enormously diverse on the one hand. So he was trained primarily as a surveyor, but and hence, I guess, a lot of his records show up at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is, after all, a museum of anthropology. He engaged in a lot of ethnographic writing and particularly sketching, as well as amassing objects that came to be seen as anthropological objects, and also amassing a large collection of photographs. So he's got these enormously diverse kind of this enormously diverse archive. That really begins, you know, with the voyage on the way out to India, with this kind of, you know, ostensibly sort of jocular kind of journal that talks about, you know, dropping his hat over the side of the ship and then paints a little sketch of that, and then sort of starts to get into more kind of serious business once you know, in the Indian Ocean, or so it seems. But what I guess this allows for is, I think, quite a sort of a relatively well-rounded notion of kind of his diverse interests, his very diverse output. And he is one of the many figures who is absolutely complicit and, you know, a central agent of colonial expansion, particularly in his case into the Naga Hills. He does a lot of, you know, kind of pioneering survey work there in the 1870s, but also then north of the Brahmaputra Valley. And he also then goes across, particularly during the Second Anglo-Afghan War, to portions of the northwest frontier. And, you know, all the time is kind of rendering sketches of people, of landscapes. But we also have, through, you know, the diaries as well as the sketches, the kind of admission of uncertainty, moments where, you know, he does come across as, I guess, a complex individual. And I found those kind of archives and those kind of individuals, you know, really productive to work with, and certainly much more, at least there's sort of some prospect of some form of sympathy with them in a way that there isn't perhaps for some, you know, certain figures who perhaps do show up in the colonial archives as that much more kind of one-dimensional. People like Charles Napier, for instance, in Sindh from the 1840s, who, you know, comes across as a megalomaniac, and you know, isn't as kind of ambivalent and nuanced. So yeah, officials do matter. And I think in certain cases, at least, we're fortunate enough to have sufficiently rich archives that we're able to see how they are always complex rather than these sort of caricatured, personalities. I hope that in some way answers your question. There's lots more I could say, by the way, about Woodthorpe, and I will just actually mention one thing, which is to say that he became, as part of becoming a sort of frontier specialist, he's absolutely one of these individuals that you mentioned then in your question, whose expertise is simultaneously taken to be very deeply embedded in the specificity of place, of particular places within the Indian frontier, but also, and seemingly contradictorily, we're seen then as sort of rendering him a frontier specialist of frontiers everywhere. So he was often called upon by the Anthropological Institute in London, the Royal Geographical Society, to sort of give his expert opinion on papers delivered sort of frontier zones, on ostensibly tribal communities from a vast swathe of the world. So yeah, he's an interesting example of that phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are a number of these characters that kind of corner the frontier market, as it were. I mean, one that also comes up is of course Thomas Holditch, whose works takes him from British Indian frontiers as far south as the Argentine-Chilean frontier. But I mean, one of the things that your work does, which is so nice, is on the one hand, you do take these men in the frame of Martin Bailey's kind of knowledge entrepreneurs that are doing certain things, but at the same time, you do humanize them, or rather give a fuller picture of them without at the same time, inhabiting their skin too freely. Because to say that these are flawed characters is an understatement. But the really nice thing in your work as well is in doing that, you're also giving us a fantastic insight into the very personal nature of the colonial state. Even as it's bureaucratizing and becoming more professional in the late 19th century, nonetheless, the importance and imprint of personality comes through very clearly. I mean, this is so exciting, Tom. You can't see how the Q&A has just exploded here. And I know I had sent you some questions beforehand, but I'm going to go off script here because you're just getting so much engagement here. I really do wish we were all together in person, because I think this would be a fantastic conversation. I'm going to use the question or your answer there about some of these personalities and actually take a pair of questions from Miriam Sabri, who asked about the impact and the paradox of Mckenzie and other surveyor generals on your story, which then turns us to perhaps your second chapter, where you talk about cartography and surveys. And I wonder, we've been talking a lot about the colonial state, bureaucracy, and the personnel, but as you said, in talking about historiography, one of the interventions you make and one of the conversations you want to have is with the history of science. So using the surveyors generals and Mckenzie, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how cartography and science plays into your story.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's lovely to hear that there are questions coming in. I'm not sort of currently looking at the Q&A myself, but thanks to everyone who's engaging. And I hope that they're not just vehement criticisms of what I'm saying. Yeah, that's a great sort of area to open out. So I suppose I should explain that, yeah, cartography and surveys and mapping occupies a kind of standalone chapter within the book. It's the second chapter. And it's something that I became increasingly fascinated by over the course of writing my PhD in the first instance. And really it's in some ways become the kind of centerpiece of some of the work I'm doing at the moment. So it remains, a source of real fascination well beyond India's frontiers alone. I think that to Miriam's question on Colin Mckenzie and other surveyors general, so it's worth saying, first of all, that I should admit that Colin Mckenzie, I don't think features at all in the book as an individual, although I've been lucky enough to recently review an excellent overview of his work by Tobias Wolfhard, and can sort of thoroughly recommend that in terms of drawing together and building on sort of older scholarship on Mckenzie. But the Surveyors General, I guess, they do play an important part in the story. Andrew Waugh is probably the single Surveyor General who is sort of most prominent, and he is particularly prominent in relation to his kind of interventions and work and attempts to, rather flawed attempts, it should be added, to sort of control from a distance the work on the series of the GTS, the Great Trigonometrical Survey. And I suppose what in some ways your question brings to mind for me, Miriam, is to me, the Surveyors General had a relatively limited effect in some respects on the particularities of frontier surveying, and often they as indeed so many officials in other spheres of the colonial state that were at the sort of upper echelons, attempting to exert some sort of control on frontiers from a distance, often basically ended up more or less failing to do so, and failing in some cases quite farcically to do so. So, Waugh was sort of, utterly insistent on attempting to micro the instruments, the men who were using the instruments, the way those men used their body to use the instruments, and it sort of goes without saying that he kind of couldn't. So I'll leave you to read the relevant chapter for some details of that. But it's a really good instance, I think, of that broader theme within the book. Broadly speaking.
Can I
sorry
with just a quick follow-up, because we're talking about these personalities. Can you talk a little bit about the technologies, and in particular, do you see a slippage between technologies of science and technologies of violence deployed in these spaces by the colonial state? I mean, the example I gave you was thinking of heliotropes, which are used by the trigonometrical survey, versus the heliographs that are used by the British Indian Army. Especially in these frontier spaces. I remember some fantastic prints from the Illustrated London News showing during the Ambala campaign in 1863 that the troops were using heliographs to signal each other across the mountains. So if you could talk a little bit about technology.
Yeah, so the heliotropes, heliographs is a really great example, it's one where there is a clear overlap of survey technologies and sort of technologies of military violence, and it again, I'm sure it will go without saying to many members of the audience that surveying in British India was through and through a military enterprise, and particularly in frontier regions, it was so in ways that sort of went beyond how it was elsewhere in colonial India. Much of the time, particularly insofar as trigonometrical surveying in particular in frontier areas, rather than trigonometrical surveying sort of viewing frontier features from a distance, from kind of outside of those frontier areas, from in fully administered areas, relied wholly on quite large accompanying military parties, was often very clearly shaped and openly shaped by the perceived threat of violence, and often descended into direct violence. So that's worth saying up front. One thing that I'm interested in, I guess, in the book, and I think there's a couple of examples of some two things that I'd like to kind of bring out in answering your question, Ben, is how survey instruments and materials were actually quite fragile, and so often they were kind of, as it were, victims of instances of violence in frontier regions, and then how they were also prone to being interpreted in quite interesting and sort of in ways that surprised colonial surveyors by frontier inhabitants. So on the first of of those themes. An instance of kind of fragility that I particularly like, I've got to say, it was one of those moments in the archive where I was very happy to sort of come across this, is an example of a map which had been rendered through basically sort of what was still a relatively new technology at this time in map printing in India. It'd been rendered on calico rather than just paper to make it more durable. However, it was taken out sort of into the field, into the frontier during the Second Anglo-Afghan War by Woodthorpe, in fact, by Robert Woodthorpe, and then was shot through and rendered totally useless during a skirmish. So this is a particularly sort of visceral instance, I guess, of the kind of materials of survey and mapping having these very kind of almost mundane limitations and being fragile. And that to me is really important. And it picks up, I guess, this is one way in which I try to relate the frontier to a broader in the historiography of science in recent years, which emphasizes how the kind of passage of the materials of knowledge was always contested. It was always quite laborious and hard, and actually it tended to fail as much as to succeed. And that's an example of, material failure, if you like. And then an instance I just want to sort of raise quickly on this idea that survey materials and instruments and technologies were prone to being sort of, should we say, actively interpreted by frontier inhabitants in ways that could sort of subvert colonial expectations. Again, I really sort of like this particular instance. There was a moment in the early 1870s when a community of Lushais in what is now the Indian state of Mizoram understood, or it was reported by the colonial surveyor, that this community understood a large survey mark that was used for theodolite sightings. So it was the sort of mark that was looked at through the theodolite telescope, to be an effigy of Queen Victoria, and thus a kind of symbolic, or so the survey official interpreted this in turn, thus a sort of symbolic representation of British power. And so the surveyor concerned and the survey party concerned sort of thought, actually, that's quite a productive kind of misunderstanding, and sought to kind of make use of it in turn to promote the idea that the survey mark kind of placed this community under surveillance, that it was actually a means of, kind of overseeing them. So it was an example of, I guess, the ways in which violence, survey, and kind of materials were all bound up in, but also in ways that were quite unpredictable and not totally controlled by, agents of empire. They were sort of part of much more complex and convoluted sort of dialogues.
That's absolutely fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions that really want to drag you to a comparative frame, but before I get there, I actually want to turn us to something that you do quite interesting in your book, in a way kind of somewhat unexpectedly. And that is your focus on Baluchistan. I mean, for especially the growth of material that's come out in the past decade or so about the frontier spaces, and especially the northwest frontier, so much of it has focused on the kind of Pashtun borderlands, what would today be the tribal agencies, which are overwhelmingly in what is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or under the colonial government was Northwest Frontier Province. But you argue that there's been an overemphasis on the Punjab, and that we need to look at Baluchistan and its predecessor Sindh. I mean, you go back and you look at the Sindh frontier in particular. And this also brings up some of the personalities, one of whom you haven't mentioned, but that Miriam Yakubi asks about in her question. That is, of course, Robert Sandeman, who I write about pretty substantively. So could you talk about your decision and perhaps maybe justify it a little bit, your focus on Baluchistan, this kind of forgotten backwater of colonial governance? I mean, Baluchistan isn't even elevated, it's an agency only because Sandeman pushes it through. And it is one of these kind of original spaces that has a direct line to the viceroy as opposed to a lieutenant governor. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your focus on Baluchistan for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the sort of invitation to talk about it, because I think it is quite an important feature in the book. So this is one way of putting it, and this is certainly partially true, is that actually it's in part a matter of kind of addressing a bit of an imbalance in the existing scholarship. Particularly, I think, I mean, less so because, as you've said, you, Ben, have written about Sandeman. Others, Sandeman shows up quite a lot in work by Christian Tripodi and others, for that matter. But I think that there is a little bit of something of a gap, particularly in sort of, in two areas. Firstly, on the kind of, Upper Sind / Baluchistan frontier prior to Sandeman. Although David Gilmartin's work on Indus irrigation and so on touches upon this, but I think there is still something of a gap. There's also been a wealth of amazing work on Punjab frontier, and while I think I try to bring in some case studies from Punjab that in some cases haven't been as discussed, it is certainly historiographically well represented by some brilliant recent work. So partly it's about redressing an imbalance, and the other way in which I think Baluchistan has been really sort of obviously underrepresented is in the peculiarities of British engagements during and after Sandeman's era, but away from Quetta and away from the agency territories in particular. And so I end up discussing quite a lot, the degree to which Baluchistan became a fractal space, to use Mandi Sedan's terminology, insofar as British administrators kept on subdividing it into ever more sort of complex nested forms of sort of looser and looser regulations. And so, I was particularly interested in the way in which, yes, Baluchistan as an agency kind of comes into being, but then some of the sort of freedom of action that officials had enjoyed up to that point, that was perhaps removed with sort of the partial formalisation of British rule in the agency territories, became sort of shunted further to the southwest. And then, they took on these sort of ostensibly kind of heroic ventures into the desert, contacting and, working with and through more outlying communities. So I think that, some of the scholarship that has touched on Baluchistan hasn't necessarily kind of gone into detail on that sort of fractal aspect of the Baluchistan frontier. So I did want to sort of foreground that. I think, though, that trying to sort of put up should we say, a kind of a stronger defence of, Baluchistan as somewhere that's really important, and perhaps somewhere that has a lot to say, in relation to Punjab. I do think looking at Baluchistan and perhaps prioritising Baluchistan has repercussions for our understanding of the Punjab frontier. In particular, I think many kind of techniques of knowledge and government that were applied at the fringes of Punjab drew on techniques that had already been deployed in Baluchistan. And they did so in sort of sometimes two very different ways. So in some cases, Baluchistan was an exemplar for things that might be done in Punjab. One instance of this would be to do with sort of canal colonies and irrigation schemes and attempts to resettle, that is, to forcibly move or entice and then partially forcibly move whole communities, which occurred in frontier, certainly prior to occurring on Punjab frontier. And then in other cases, of course, and it has been written about degree, but I certainly try to substantiate it in relation to anthropology and ethnography. Baluchistan it is kind of constructed as an explicit counterpoint to the Punjab frontier. I suppose most obviously in the kind of at least occasional categorical distinction that is posited between Baluch and Pashtun communities. And so, yeah, in the ethnography chapter, I try to go into sort of some detail on this kind of oscillation between, on the one hand, categorical distinction, and then on the other, attempts to kind of draw Baluch and Pashtun communities into a sort of shared analytical framework and suggest that actually there is quite a lot of overlap. That also shows up in the chapter on administration. So, yeah, I do think that there's both a kind of, as it were, a historiographical relative absence or underplay reason to bring Baluchistan to the fore. But there's also then has repercussions for our understanding of kind of where matters in the development and subsequent communication of modes of making and understanding frontiers across British India.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, such a rich discussion to have there. You know, you bring up some of the fantastic new work that's come out. Elizabeth Leake's work on the Pashtun parts of the frontier, Yaqub Bangesh and his work on the Khanate of Khalat. At the same time, I love how you just, on the one hand, again, mirror this theme that comes up again and again in your book about how, on the one hand, it's about the particularity of place of the Baluch versus the Pashtun, and yet at the same time they become very intermingled. I mean, the one that comes to mind is that Sandeman, of course, before he goes to Baluchistan and creates the agency, he'd been the district commissioner up in Deri Ghazi Khan amongst the Pashtun, and bring the idea of the Jirga down. Or the other one, you talk about how Baluchistan, some of the ideas from Baluchistan travel to other places. I mean, Henry Dobbs, who was an agent in Baluchistan, then when he goes to Iraq as part of the expeditionary force in 1914, he's the one that brings the frontier crimes regulation to Iraq, which is passed as the tribal civil and criminal disputes resolution or regulation in Iraq. So yeah, I mean, a fantastic kind of airing of that, on the one hand, particularity of knowledge and of practice, and at the same time, the flattening character of imperial governance. Yeah, to push on this a little bit, in that chapter, you do actually begin it in part by talking about how you nuance the idea, in particular, frontier governmentality through your discussion of Baluchistan. And I wonder if I could push you just for a few words on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I promise I'm not just saying this because you're chairing the session then, but, you know, as with a lot of other scholars of frontiers more broadly, and particularly in colonial India, yeah, your frontier governmentality has been immensely sort of suggestive and important for my work. I guess what I want to sort of try to do with it is, in some ways, to think about almost, I'll put it in slightly abstract terms and then clarify. I want to sort of doubly pluralize it. So in other words, I want to render frontier governmentality plural in two distinct ways. So let me try to explain that. The first way is to say that, to my mind, colonial interactions with frontier populations in particular tended to be, and actually also frontier environments, tended to be driven by a kind of oscillation between competing logics. So on the one hand, you have the logic that I think you, Ben, in your work focus in on really brilliantly, the sort of notion of the imperial object. As I say, I think your work diagnoses that, explains what it means and what it adds up to. On the other, I guess, I feel that in the figures that I'm looking at, there is a kind of an alternative register that remains present, even if at times it's shunted slightly to the background. And that is more a kind of logic of colonial subjecthood, i.e. the notion that frontier tribes can be reformed, they can be supposedly reclaimed in some way, they can be changed. And to my mind, it's perhaps less about the sort of ultimate kind of winning out of one of those logics over the other, and more about this kind of interplay between them that often goes all the way down to individual frontier officers who seem, sort of in one paragraph of a given letter to advocate a way of understanding frontier populations and indeed, as I say, environments and spaces as something that is utterly resistant to kind of British-led reform and the classic word of the time, improvement. And then on the other, and in the next paragraph sometimes, there'll be a totally different logic that suggests actually, people and spaces can be improved. They can be interacted with and changed. And so to my mind, it's about that sort of oscillation. And that's one way in which I would want to sort of pluralize the idea of frontier governmentality. And then the second way, and this I think particularly comes in the chapter on administration, the 5th chapter, is that my reading is, and I think this might in some ways, this is at least an attempt to be slightly contrary to what we might expect to be the case and what I think a lot of histories have expected to be the case. I understand that the sort of earlier to mid-19th century to in many ways have been marked out by more, not less, ambitious, and it should be added, enormously violent and disruptive forms of colonial intervention. And I particularly look in that chapter at a specific sort of mode of frontier governmentality, which was displacing and then relocating entire communities, which I've already alluded to in an earlier answer. I then go on later in the chapter to sort of identify perhaps a slightly different mode of frontier governmentality, particularly in relation to Rajasthan and then in the Naga Hills in the northeast, from the kind of later 1860s onwards, which, although it was more spatially expansive and probably more kind of, how to put it, more information intensive, was actually in key respects less ambitious than those earlier projects. So while there was still a kind of an element of a notion of improvement in this later period, governing in accordance with what was taken to be some form of tribal custom became increasingly important. And I suppose at least pockets of these regions, and certainly particular communities within them, became widely configured as kind of permanently frontier communities, set aside kind of once and for all, not spaces that were going to be subsumed as part of a sort of rolling progressive frontier, but spaces and populations that would always be different. And so in that respect, I guess the logic of the imperial object, as you put it, comes more to the fore, certainly. But what I try to show is that there's always a kind of strain of, as it were, colonial subject thinking that disrupts that logic or nuances it and renders it more complex. So that's the second way in which I would want to suggest, I guess, that frontier governmentalities in the plural did change kind of over time in important ways, even if that change over time was always incomplete. I hope that makes sense to everyone.
Completely. And I think it really does capture this tension, which really goes to the core of your argument about the multiplicities of discourse and paradoxes, if not contradictions, of colonial governance and colonial officialdom. I mean, certainly there is that ever-present strain of improvement, if not civilizational discourse, that we can also map onto, I mean, for the individuals you look at, the upsurge within British society of evangelical Christianity. I mean, a lot of these characters that you deal with, and a lot of the spaces you deal with, have evangelical Christians, as well as on the Northeast, missionary activities. I mean, the American Baptists are really important up here, right?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, this type of over time, as we get into the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, an almost writing off of these people as beyond civilization. At the very same time, we have, as you point out in your ethnography chapter, the growth of ethnography, anthropometry, and trying to distinguish and categorize these people in ways to demonstrate their separateness. So completely agree with you on that. I'm cognizant we're just about out of time, but I want to get one more substantive question and one final question in. So the more substantive one, I'm going to condense one or a couple from Tom Timberg and Jameson Carnes, and they really want to push you in the comparative frame. Jameson asks about comparing it to the United States, for instance, and Tom really pushes you into the British imperial space. Obviously, there's resonances in your work with other imperial civilizational and governing spaces. And I wonder if you could just kind of at a broad level comment both where you see your work engaging outside the Indian subcontinent and what kind of lessons you think it can both learn but take to those other spaces.
Yeah, thanks for raising those questions. And yeah, it's particularly wonderful to hear that Jameson's on the call. I was lucky enough to get to know Jameson during a research trip to Delhi a few years ago. So I hope you're keeping well. So on this question on the American dimension of it, again, I suppose one of the things that's interested me most is the way in which the US functions as an important imaginative space for some of the actors that I'm interested in looking at. So yet again, it's the sort of dreaded actors category answer, I'm afraid. In that, I suppose I've already alluded, I think, to the fact that some of the models of frontier making drawn from scholarship that's primarily US focused, I think are very suggestive in the case of South Asia, but certainly have their limitations. But on the other hand, it's absolutely true that agents of empire, one of whom in particular I'm thinking of is Curzon, find drawing on ideas of the American West and Southwest absolutely vital. And so Curzon's sort of abrupt shift that I mentioned in his 1907 lecture is associated with him turning to Frederick Jackson Turner as a scholar of frontiers, and he explicitly relates what he's saying about imperial frontiers as a kind of crucible for changing young British men to the sort of frontier imaginary that Turner's putting forward, a decade and a bit earlier. And actually, the book, of my book, that is, The Frontier in British India, is at least meant to have a kind of echo of, sort of the frontier in American history element. Again, not because I think that Turner is a scholar that we should necessarily look to, as sort of someone we should align ourselves with, but as someone who is part of an active debate among empire builders around the turn of the 20th century about what India's frontiers should be all about. It might also be mentioned that, the American frontier shows up much earlier as well, in some really unexpected places. There's one particular instance where in the Khasi Hills in the northeast, an administrator, a soldier administrator, is seeking to justify a particular policy which has basically been tried a couple of years earlier in that very area and has already failed on its own terms to achieve what it was heralded as being there to do. And so, as part of this kind of what I talk about as a sort of frontier forgetting, the soldier administrator sort of ignores that recent example of failure and turns instead to justifying his policy by referring to the novels of James Fenimore Cooper and the rendering of the American West and sort of the Appalachians in those novels. And so it's this sort of expansive, pretty and some would say underpowered kind of analysis but it sort of serves the purpose, and they try to adopt the policy again, and it fails again. So the US is an important sort of imaginative space. Right the way through my story, it shows up in that kind of fashion. To Tom's question, which is a great one. Yeah, there are all sorts of kind of comparisons that I'd like to draw. One in particular that I became quite interested in was reading some of the material that I had on these really sort of horrendous episodes of colonial violence, alongside work on settler colonial frontiers, particularly, I guess, in historiography on Australia. So discourses around, extermination of entire groups of people, and this kind of the ways in which agents of empire attempted to rationalize what, I guess, often they acknowledged was morally an incredibly dubious set of practices. It was something that I thought had real. It's the scholarship on, for instance, Tasmania, and on Robinson and the friendly mission in Tasmania in the 1830s, and encounters between the British and Aboriginal communities in that region really resonated with some of the themes of kind of really extreme forms of violence directed against entire communities that were showing up really around the same time, often 1830s, 1840s, at British India's frontiers. So that's just one way in which you could look to those frontiers, but there's any number of others. And yeah, I'd love to have a discussion, certainly with you, Tom, about some of the ways we might draw this all into even broader comparative frameworks. So thanks for those questions.
I mean, it's so rich. Even though that comparison between Turner and British India appears in my own book, I must admit I had forgotten about Curzon's turn in the essay until I looked at yours. We're right up against time, but it would be remiss of me not to ask you, what's next? What are you working on next?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'll take another hour to outline what it is. No, I will promise I'll keep it short. So I guess more recently I've already shifted. I mean, such is the length of time it takes, even with quite an efficient production process, to produce a book. I guess I've already done some of the shifting towards work that's more at the intersection of environmental history and the history of environmental sciences. Especially as they develop in sort of upland and desert regions in Asia. So I've recently completed some articles and chapters, just to sort of give a shout out to them in the hopes on histories of mountain spaces, which came out in the Historical Journal a few years back. Knowing and encountering ice in colonial Asia. Is coming out in a volume called Ice Humanities, hopefully later this year, which I really enjoyed doing, I should add. And also on kind of another article on shifting concepts of discovery in geography and hydrology in the Eastern Himalaya. So those are some of the things I have been working on, but I'm now part of a project called Making Climate History, based in Cambridge, which is a joint project between historians of science and geographers. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in climate cartography as part of that. So cartographic representations of climate and climate knowledge as it develops in the Himalaya and in Central Asia. So those are some of the things. I'm working on too much, and hopefully at least doing some of them half well. But yeah, that hopefully
as any good scholar should. And it sounds like you should have a conversation with Dan Haynes, because I know he's working on some similar stuff. Well, we are right up to time. Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your time with us. To the audience, thank you for sharing your time with us and your questions. I apologize for those that I was not able to integrate. A reminder as well that we have our annual book giveaway. We will be drawing the lucky winner out of our attendees and contacting you for a copy of Tom's book, again, The Frontier in British India, which I wholly recommend to all of you. It's a fantastic read, and I think will really be field defining for years to come. A final reminder, our next installation of the new books in Asian studies will be another Frontier volume, this time with another colleague and friend, Kyle Gardner, who will be joining us in March. So please keep your eyes peeled for that announcement. But once again, Tom, thank you so much for your work, for your conversation, for your scholarship, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to everyone who's put this on and everyone who's attended. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much.